Hey guys, how's it going? Just thought I'd share some things with you. I'm kind of going through this book. I want to try to go through some books. I got a lot of them that I need to go through, and this is something I've been interested in, so I jump back and forth between different books. But this has to do with covenant theology, and from some reviews I read, this is a pretty good book. The Christ of the Covenants, O. Palmer Robertson. I don't really know that guy, but a lot of people said this was good for like classic covenant theology. And there's a section in here comparing covenant theology to dispensationalism, and it's not a huge section, but I do like some of the stuff I read in there, and I want to talk about that more at some point. I've already mentioned things here and there about that. Basically, the two major, systems of thought of, how to interpret the Old Testament and the New Testament and, the Bible all together. You have covenant theology and dispensationalism. And I think that dispensationalism is newer. And, when I first got saved and started reading the Bible, I was learning dispensationalism because it's very popular. And I have some really good books on that I haven't even went through those all the way either. But, and I'll show those, go over those. I've mentioned having them before. Anyway, and these don't have to necessarily be, the two main views, and there's also, variations within these views. But, I've known a little more about dispensationalism, because I've heard more of that, and I'm interested in covenant theology. Covenant theology, a lot of people think is associated with Calvinism, and so I'm looking into that to see, if that has anything to do with it. I really don't think that it has to. But I was surprised at something that this book kind of gets into, which I shouldn't have been surprised at all, really, but I started taking notes, and so basically, there's 7 basic covenants. And I think with dispensationalism, there's 7 different, dispensations too. And that's just a number in the Bible, 7, number of perfection. It's used a lot. And so I guess, when people came up with these systems, these are like the major 7 that they've seen, or it just happened to be that way that it turned out to be 7 of them. But I think... Covenant of Redemption. And I might not even got this right. I basically just looked at the table of contents for this, but let me see. I don't know if the Covenant of Redemption is its own separate thing. Oh. These are all the Covenant of Redemption, so that's kind of wrong. There's the Covenant of Creation. So the first one might be the Covenant of Creation. I may have actually made that mistake there, but I'll just have to remember to change this. So maybe this is how it's supposed to be. The first one might be the Covenant of Creation. The second one's the Covenant with Adam, commencement. 3 is with Noah, preservation. 4 is with Abraham, promise. 5 is with Moses, law. 6 is with David, kingdom. 7 is with Christ, consummation. And I think these are all the divine covenants. That means that these are covenants that God made with man. And so he goes on to explain, what is a covenant, and there's different interpretations for that. And so this person gives his. He says that it's basically a bond in blood, and what he means by in blood, he means life and death. And he says it's sovereignly administrated. So it's a bond in blood, sovereignly administrated. And so sovereign's associated with Calvinism a lot, but God is sovereign, and a Calvinist interpretation of the sovereignty of God means that God can't be sovereign unless he predetermined everything. But a real under biblical understanding of the sovereignty of God is just that God is in control, okay, and nothing's outside of God's control. It doesn't mean that God has determined everything. Man has a free will, and so this doesn't necessarily have to do with anything with you know, it's a bond that's administrated by God, basically, and in blood meaning life or death. And usually a bond is established verbally, and sometimes a symbolic action is attached, such as the rainbow after the flood. So God promised to never flood the world again, and he gave the rainbow as a symbol of that, and it's kind of like a wedding ring. When people make vows, they make this bond, and then they have the ring as a symbolic of that. And a little bit later on, and this is just stuff just at the very beginning of the book, with trying to give the definition of a covenant, and he says that a covenant and a testament are two separate things according to him, and they're both the same because they both have death as like a factor, but with a covenant there's like two stages, where death is the inauguration, and in the testament there's one stage where death activates it. So testament is not activated until death, kind of like a last will and testament. Testator does not. And one of the differences he says between a covenant and a testament is that a testator does not die as a consequence of breaking a testament. But in a covenant, death is a consequence of breaking a covenant. Okay? And also first that with a covenant, symbolic representation of death can inaugurate. So basically that has to do with, like, I guess the slaughtering of an animal in scripture, for a covenant. The slaughtering of the animal represented death, and so I still got to wrap my head around these things, but I don't know if I would agree on him with everything, but I found something I didn't agree with, and so I've tried to highlight some stuff in here as I went through. There's probably more they could have highlighted. You'll see here, a covenant is a bond in blood, sovereignly administrated. That's the notes that I took. Just trying to get the really important stuff out of here. Okay, we got to this point where it says, it's on page 12, and basically he goes into the substitutionary atonement, which I've recently rejected. And so he says that Christ died as a substitute for the covenant breaker. Substitution is essential for the understanding of the death of Christ. And I guess it's not the substitutionary atonement that's wrong, but the fact that Christ took our punishment is what's really the issue. So I guess maybe I was kind of prematurely worried there, but he gets into that later. He says his death was covenantal, not a testimony. And this is kind of why he thinks it's important to see a difference between a covenant and a testament, is because of the death of Christ. Certainly it's true that the Christian is presented in Scripture as an heir of God, but he is heir by process of adoption into the family of the never-dying God, by the process of testimony He is heir by the process of adoption into the family of the never-dying God, but by process of testamentary disposition. On the popular level, it has been assumed that the Lord's Last Supper was the occasion of Christ making his last will and testament, but it must be remembered that there was a covenantal meal that was being celebrated on this occasion. In the context of the covenantal meal of the Passover, Jesus introduced the provisions of the new covenant meal. Clearly his intention was to proclaim himself as Passover lamb who was taking on himself the curses of the covenant. So that's the issue that I really have. That's what I really have issue with, saying that Jesus took on the curses of the covenant. But maybe I'm understanding this wrong. I don't know. His death was substitutionary. His blood was poured out for his people. His words were not those of testamentary disposition, but those of covenant fulfillment and inauguration. So this is just a lot for me to wrap my head around, but I don't agree with the penal substitutionary atonement. And maybe I'm understanding this wrong. I need to learn how the relation to the Passover lamb is to Christ. And, I want to do a study on the atonement that I've been interested in. And I've got some other good books on that I've been going through. And, the atonement's always going to be a mystery, a lot of aspects of it, but I do think that we can learn a lot more. And so basically I'm going to come up with, questions that would generally people would want to have answered and try to answer them. Taking on himself the curses of the covenant. His death was substitutionary. So maybe, I was thinking that he was, what he was saying is what penal substitutionary atonement teaches, basically, that Jesus took on the sins of mankind and he was punished for those sins. Maybe that's not what it means. Maybe it just means his death itself, because death is like a curse. Death is, death is a consequence of our sin. And Jesus never sinned, but he did die. So maybe that's simply what it means. Maybe it's not going into the whole... Well, I'm sure the person does believe in penal substitutionary atonement, because like almost everybody does. So, but I'm just trying to understand that. Maybe this isn't... I'm thinking that this might not really be a big issue with covenant theology. I may not agree with some of the interpretations of this guy, but I don't think that it's really a major deal yet. So now I'm thinking maybe I was wrong about that. Let me see what else said. Covenant is not a testament. Covenant is a bond in blood. It involves commitments with life and death consequences. A long history has marked the analysis of the covenant in terms of mutual compacts or contracts. Recent scholarship. So basically he was saying that, in history people view covenants as a contract, which kind of makes sense. But he sees it a little bit differently. Anyways, I need to go through all these, and I want to learn about each individual covenant, but that's just kind of what I was going over the other day. So I'll share that with you. God bless.